Hello everybody, this is For the Masses podcast. We're trying out something new, or I'm trying out something new rather. I'm going to sort of analyse a certain point of the day's news in detail, explain its background, sort of give an in-depth analysis of, for example, the events leading up to it, what exactly happened, and the significance of this event or set of events. The first one I wanted to do is something that's been in the news recently in Britain, and presumably in several European countries as well, specifically this EU-UK row about vaccine procurement, specifically in relation to AstraZeneca. If you don't know what that is, don't worry, that's the whole point of the explanation, is to learn a little bit more. So hopefully these things will be about 10-15 minutes on average, and I'm hoping to do them about 5 days a week, just so I can sort of get considerable momentum for the podcast. So let's start with why here and why now. The first question we're going to ask. So it is the culmination of several trends. First and foremost, it's to do with the relative performance of the EU and the UK's vaccine programmes. The fact that the EU's vaccination programme was far less successful than the UK's is one of the main roots for the current crisis in many respects. It only makes sense in light of this fact. This is down to quite a few factors, but one of them is that the EU has tended to prioritise other things when thinking about the vaccine procurement programme. It has tended to be slow because it has very little experience of not vaccine procurement, but other forms of procurement. For example, when it comes to military contracts, it is not used to competitive contracts, not used to competing with other nations when it comes to contracts in sort of a very cutthroat way, in a way that other nations like the US, the UK and Israel tend to be, especially in relation to military contracts. So that's one element. Another is that the EU has this principle known as the precautionary principle. This is the idea that we should think about the worst case scenario when it comes to making a decision on whether you are to, for example, approve a vaccine, and think about, we are making a decision to minimise that risk rather than to, for example, maybe get the best benefit in the abstract. This has meant that, for example, the EU was relatively slow to OK vaccines that had been approved by other health agencies, such as the UK's health agency, which was the first in the world, or first major one in the world, to approve the vaccine. So, in contrast, I think the UK's political culture is peculiarly flexible. The UK is willing to think about, for example, that it is necessary in tough times to make emergency exceptions to general rules about vaccines. They're experimenting with, for example, giving the shot early, and also extending the length of time between the first and second shots, because it will save a lot of people's lives if the first shot and the second shot, the length of time between them is increased, because by doing that you'll give more people the first shot, which increases immune protection to a considerable extent, such a considerable extent that it is worth getting more of the vulnerable vaccinated with that, even if it confers slightly less immunity. The second trend is obviously with Brexit, the fact that the European Union and the UK are now up for direct comparison in regard to things that both the European Union and the UK are attempting to do together, and sort of against each other in broad terms, means that there is capacity for far more direct comparison. And this is often unflattering for either side, but in this particular case, it is unflattering for the EU. The EU decided it was going to take sole responsibility for vaccine procurement, and as a result of that political decision, you can really directly compare. You can really pin the blame of the slow, lacklustre vaccine procurement on the European Union. The European Union said that because it is one big bloc, it is going to be desirable for the vaccine companies, in order to come to the European Union, to sell their vaccines to a large amount of customers. That was at least the plan. Instead, what the UK has shown is that the EU has been really quite slow and inefficient, and done something that has actively harmed the nations which make up the European Union by slowing down their vaccination campaigns. So that's the second thing. The third thing is really quite poor leadership when it comes to the European Union, and poor structures of accountability, as well as poor structures of electing or giving power, or raising up leaders in the first place. Ursula von der Leyen, in my opinion, has been shown in this crisis to be quite an incompetent leader at times. In many respects, this is not the sort of person that you would want to be leading Europe, but because she was a compromise candidate, one that was acceptable to both Emmanuel Macron and Angela Merkel, she got the job. And in many respects, the European Union system for agreeing who is to be in charge of various important jobs within the higher echelons of European office is mostly about creating the most acceptable rather than the best performing, putting the best performing people in office. So really Ursula von der Leyen shows that she was a really quite poor defence minister in Germany, scandal-ridden and unsatisfactory. And the fact that she's now European Commissioner and is likely to continue being European Commissioner, at least for the remainder of her term, shows that the drawbacks of having the unelected, unaccountable unelectable, accountable officials in charge of the European Union generally. That's not to say there are benefits to the European Union. There are, but this is I think one of its most considerable drawbacks. So hence, basically a really quite incompetent junior minister with little experience is more or less de facto head of the European Union, calling shots on several important decisions. This is not a good outcome, not a desirable outcome, and there is very little people can do to remove her. So now we've dealt with that, the background, we're going to sort of move on to part two. What happened? Well, let's start with AstraZeneca. So AstraZeneca is one of the first companies to produce a vaccine. The vaccine is very cheap, and at this stage it is one of the three most widespread vaccines, especially within the European Union and the UK. It said to the European Union that it cannot deliver what it said it could have delivered. It said it could deliver to the European Union as a result of inefficiencies at its European plant. This was something that had already happened with the UK's plant with AstraZeneca in the very early stages of our rollout of our vaccine, but as that was back in December, and since then those early bumps on the roads have been dealt with mostly. So the EU, as a result of this, got quite angry, in part because it was already behind in the vaccine race for reasons that have already been stated. It had low supply. When we're talking about vaccines at this point, we're talking about usually the supply of vaccines being the limiting factor rather than doctors or nurses putting it into people's arms. And so the EU found this to be a good way of potentially lashing out for two reasons. I think the first is that hopefully they could get more by complaining to AstraZeneca, potentially of the UK supply, and the second reason is potentially to pin some blame on the AstraZeneca, on the vaccine procurement debacle, on the private companies rather than the European Union's relatively inefficient way of doing things. So you had a few things that went on. Macron, for example, and several German ministers, I think Jens Spahn, called the vaccine, the AstraZeneca vaccine, ineffective in certain ways. Macron specifying, for example, that over 65-year-olds, it doesn't really work, which is a pretty big thing when you're talking about a vaccine for a disease which mostly kills those who are only, which is highest kill rate is those over 65. And it also threatened to release the contract to the public, which it eventually did in a redacted form. Then the EU threatened what some suppose to be an export ban, but in actuality was an order that effectively made any exports going out of the European Union more of vaccines being more transparent, and a company has to declare when they are exporting a vaccine. But then, most crucially, the European Union, specifically, it has been widely commented. It was probably Ursula von der Leyen who effectively made the order. Article 16 of the Northern Ireland Protocol was triggered. This proved hugely controversial and brings us on to our third part. Part 3 is why is Northern Ireland, this Northern Ireland Protocol, Article 16, so controversial, and why was Ursula von der Leyen and the European Commission forced to back down. Article 16 of the NIP is basically an essential part of the Brexit divorce settlement. It is meant to be used as a temporary and emergency measure in order to combat something which either the European Union or the UK deems to be seriously threatening their interests, and all other avenues have been exhausted to deal with it. It allows either side to basically stop exports to the other side, and it allows the other side to take proportionate measures in response. The important thing here is that A, it's meant to be temporary, B, it's emergency tool of last resort. So what this implies is that there should be considerable discussions having taken place before this article is triggered, and also when it is triggered, it should be limited to very specific sets of goods. The problem is that the EU did not do this. There were no serious discussions. The problem here, and why is this is so politically catastrophic for the European Union, is this is a condition which really the European Union was most responsible for putting into the Brexit agreement. Nor the idea that there should be no hard border on the island of Ireland or between Northern Ireland and the UK is essential to the Good Friday Agreement, something which the European Union liked to emphasise was one of the most important things when upholding or when making a Brexit agreement, and was one of its red lines. The EU therefore seemed really quite hypocritical, and in many respects seemed to show a brazenly political approach to Brexit negotiation, when it immediately triggered Article 16 without any consultation, without any attempt to sort of bridge the gap between the UK and the European Union's position. Part 4 is, what are the consequences, legacy and lessons of this episode? The first big consequence is this is great for Boris. 2021 is turning out to be quite a good year for Boris Johnson. We are first in the race to vaccinate a high proportion of our population. It also gives Boris Johnson a chance to look reasonable, which many of you might say is not that big a deal, but especially after previous episodes where it's seen that Boris Johnson has been quite rash and often quite unthinking in his political relationship with both Northern Ireland and the European Union. This at least gives him the appearance of reasonableness, and also allows him to claim that at least he's as good, if not better than potentially the European Union in some regard. So, for example, we might look back to December 2019, just before the Brexit withdrawal agreement was finally signed, and when he threatened to break international law, albeit in a very specific and limited way. And we might compare that to what the European Union is doing now, and at the very least, those two threats look relatively similar in comparison to each other, and more than anything, it seems to allow Boris and his Conservatives and the Conservatives to paint this as potentially a case of clumsiness rather than malicious behaviour on behalf of the Conservative Party. The second important legacy is potentially a precedent. This is, I think, a precedent most importantly in relation to the European Union and Northern Ireland and the relationship between them. I think it's going to be very hard for anyone in the future to really create any more of a hard border. I think that this was already the case in Brexit, and obviously you had the whole 4 years of tortuous negotiations. But it's certainly not the case that this had to become a running political theme. But it seems as if it has been, and that Article 16 is unlikely to be used that regularly, and it's likely to be used only if in the most controversial in the face of most in a very controversial situation or contentious situation. It would also be very hard for the European Union, I think, to use Article 16 in the near future again, especially because the DUP has been able to use this really to paint the European Union as relatively malicious and brazenly political in its use of Article 16. The other big legacy, I think, about this is that thing that this shows, I think, is that the European Union and the UK will continue to have this quite complex interlinking relationship with one another, where they are, in many respects, tied together, although not in a formal union, in a way which requires constant negotiation and constant reaffirming of certain principles and positions in relation to one another, potentially like Switzerland does with the European Union currently, but with the UK, which is a much more influential and politically and geopolitically significant unit. The final thing I think this shows is something about vaccine nationalism, that vaccine nationalism is a potent force. And when I'm talking about vaccine nationalism, I'm really talking about the fact that the vaccine has the capability of making political and geopolitical units really act in unusual, aggressive ways in order to maximise their supply of the vaccine, because it is just so fundamentally important to getting out of this coronavirus crisis. And I think that it is far from unlikely that we will continue to see more episodes like this, potentially less explosive, but certainly it's the case that the pursuit of the vaccine is one of the most important things for most political units in 2021. So, in many respects, things are driven by politics, not niceties and moral laws and moral values. Once again, this has been my explanation of what has happened over the past few days. I hope you enjoy. If there's anything I can do to improve, please do comment or leave any feedback. I am happy to work off the back of that. Thank you. Bye.